Welcome to San Diego Integral, March 10th, 2023. Our topic today, Integral Shamanism versus the Metacrisis, presented by Layman Pascal.
Hello and welcome to San Diego Integral. We're pleased to see you here today. We're going to have an exciting presentation on integral shamanism versus the Metacrisis with the incredible Layman Pascal. I'm Eloy Mays, a member of the San Diego Integral leadership team. And before we get started, I want to mention that we'll be recording this meeting. You probably noticed when you came in. So if you prefer not to be seen in this video, typically you won't be seen. It highlights the speaker primarily. But if you end up asking a question live or something like that, you'll be on the video. So if you prefer not to be on the video, just either keep your camera off or don't partake in the live conversation. Also, you can find all of our events on our website, sandiegointegral.org. I'll put that in the chat a little later. We're also on Meetup and Facebook. You can find us there with a search. And you can find all the links on our website for the Facebook and the Meetup as well. So please join one of these groups, and that way you'll be automatically informed of upcoming meetings. And we also want to invite you to make a small donation for today and ongoing. The donations help cover our Meetup fees, web hosting, and other expenses. And you can donate at sandiegointegral.org as well. Again, going over the housekeeping during the Q&A sessions. Right now, I have everybody set up to not be able to unmute themselves, but we'll change that in a little bit. But for the introducing new people, we'll just have you raise your hand, and then I'll unmute that one person, and then later we can open up the unmute for everybody. So if you're so use the raise hand function if you have a question. Raise hand function is in the lower right hand edge of your screen. It might be under more or reactions. And if you're on a phone or a tablet, you may need to touch the screen to activate the menu at the bottom, and then you can find it under more. And we have other members of the leadership team, Jerry, Tom, and Kathy, and Susie's a new volunteer. So we'll all be watching the chat for questions and any tech issues. And right after the meeting, we'll have an informal chat segment for open conversation. I think Layman's going to stick around for some of that. So if we have additional questions or just want to go into general conversation about what we heard or how it landed, we can do it then for those that can stay. And let's do the welcome the newcomers now. So if you're new, go ahead and use the raise hand function, and I will unmute you. Sandy, there you go. So yeah, tell us where you're from and how you found us. And
yeah, I'm from Santa Cruz, California. I'm in a Gebser class with a couple of people that are here. Heard about the topic. It's one I'm very interested in, engaged in currently. So wonderful to see it. I'm curious to see what's going to be explored here.
Yeah, welcome, Sandy.
Great, thank you.
Whoops, I had you unmuted. Sorry, Ginger.
Hi, my name is Ginger. I'm in San Diego, and I guess I've joined this group a while ago through Meetup, but I've only attended one other session. Somebody sent something a while ago about it was John Vervaeke, his meaning crisis videos, and I really appreciated that. So this was a couple of years ago,
yeah,
maybe. And anyway, so I've just kind of been around, but I just never had a chance to visit. So this particular session should be really interesting in conjunction with that. So anyway.
Yeah, when we get our hybrid meetings, going, you can come join us up in Carlsbad.
Cool. Yeah, we're really close. So anyway.
Thank you. All right, Marie.
Oh gosh. Hi, I'm in Santa Rosa. I'm new here. I'm with the Gebser group, and I was just interested in the conversation and happy that I figured out where my camera was on the meetup thing. So hi, everyone.
Hi. Did we have anybody else new today? Okay. Yeah, so we'll just move on to our, Julia's new, but anxious to speak up. Okay, welcome, Julia. Why don't you tell us where you're from in the chat, and we'll hopefully talk with you later. So we're going to move on to our presentation, and to introduce our speaker, Tom Habib. I want to invite Tom Habib to step up to the mic and introduce Layman.
Thank you, Eli. So it's my pleasure to introduce Layman Pascal, who grew up among the mist-shrouded islands of the Pacific Northwest before he went to and attended the University of Victoria. He migrated to the east coast of Canada, where he now lives, his family on the north shore of the world's largest lake in Ontario, Canada. He is a meditation and yoga teacher, author of numerous books and articles under various names, which is intriguing in itself, isn't it? His philosophical work focuses on meta-progressive politics, planetary shamanism, the metaphysics of agency, nihilism in developmental context, sacred naturalness, analytic non-duality, and the integration surplus model of religion. Layman curates the Emerge website and operates as co-chair of the Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality. He's currently providing online courses through Parallax Academy and leading the seasonal meta-modern spirituality retreats in Vermont. Both of those opportunities we're going to be putting in the chat for you so that you can access them. On a bit more of a personal note, I have told Layman he's one of the most skilled synthetic thinkers in integral theory, along with Sean Espargaro-Hargens and Ken Wilber himself. This breadth and contextual integration can be seen in his operation as a liaison between the various liminal web subcultures, such as metamodernism, integral, intellectual deep web, game B, dark renaissance, to name a few. He's also been on the Voices with John Bernanke, the Stoa, Meta-Ideological Podcast, and Cadell's Last Philosophy Portal, again, to name just a few. What I've always loved about Layman is his ability to discern where you are on your journey and to offer reflections and thoughts that are neither demeaning or elitist. Please give a warm San Diego Integral welcome to my friend, Layman Pascal.
Thank you, Tom, and everybody. It's really nice to be introduced as Tom's friend. I'm Layman Pascal. This is going to be a dense, colorful, theoretical, personal, playful ordeal, maybe. We'll get a few breakout rooms. I'll pause periodically for micro breaks where we can do some rapid, tiny practices to reset ourselves. But obviously, you're going to hear a lot of words from my mouth hole, and you'll understand some of them. Others will sound strange. Arrangements might sound strange or flow past you, and that's okay. You don't have to track it all. I think we should be moving back and forth across the edge of our own comprehension. That's where the growth happens. And maybe something clicks into place when I describe it differently in 5 minutes. Maybe you wait and have a question at the end. Maybe you do perfectly track it all. I just want up front to sort of take the pressure off and say that it's not my expectation that you are the super integrally informed, perfect recipient of a metaphilosophical torrent, which you will be expected to immediately reproduce on the exam at the end. Actually, my advice for people who want understanding is that they should reread more than they read, and that they should stop when there's something that makes them go, and that they should stay focused on things that are a little bit beyond their understanding. And I think the advice for someone who's listening to a person talk is roughly the same. You don't really need my ideas so much as you need whatever my ideas might provoke for you. So if you get a flash or a feeling or an intrigue, don't be afraid to stay with that. Don't even be afraid to turn the sound off and just sit with it for a few minutes. You don't have to follow everything I'm saying. You're sifting for gold. And I think what's really going to help you be able to do that is to constantly remember the whole interior sensation of the body. It's very easy to get lost in social and digital events, and the body is always our counterweight for that. Okay, that's the prologue on how to listen. Let's go river rafting in the rapids of today's topic, which is integral shamanism versus the metacrisis. So you have some basic coordinates of what I think is going to happen. I'm going to try to define the metacrisis, try to elaborate some of its prominent features, point out how they match up with a generalized set of shamanic skills, and give a little context for how to view shamanism through an integral lens. And then we'll start looking at two key themes that are essential to shamanic wisdom and developmental practice, which are ecology and subconscious intelligence. And we'll go through our breaks, and we'll have some open Q&A time at the end. So, metacrisis, what is it? Why do we hear that word around sometimes? First and foremost, it's a cool sounding word. It's a word that points to the idea that collectively our human civilization and the many interdependent species whose fates are largely in the hands of our civilization are facing not one but several accumulating and accelerating crises. And these challenges are tangles. They're complex knots of positive and negative potential that we have to work with creatively and energetically and wisely if we're going to figure out how to have a thriving, full spectrum, healthy, developmental, planetary wisdom civilization for an integrative age, which is a goal I assume many of us share, regardless of how we might articulate that or not. So civilization has, of course, faced many periods of challenge before. But the one that we've entered into has made it very obvious that a highly novel, highly complex set of trends is occurring at a scale and a tempo that we can't afford to adapt to in the usual way. Now, the usual way is to just suffer and die and allow slow intergenerational evolution to produce a new sensibility. But all those past changes were slow enough to do that, and in a way they were relatively superficial. By superficial, I mean that past civilizational crises occurred in a world whose background was relatively stable and familiar. Several thousand years ago, there was a period known as the Bronze Age collapse. It was a rough time. Civilization went offline for a few hundred years, but the world was basically the same before and after. Human bodies were basically the same. Very dramatic changes occurred, but they left the basics unchanged. The new convergent challenges that are epitomized in the idea of the metacrisis each have the possibility to change almost everything we take for granted as fundamental. We know what a lot of these challenges are. Maybe I'll detour to remind us of a few of those. We have weapons of increasing mass destruction circulating and proliferating. We know that machine intelligence is now at a point where it's taking over human social and creative knowledge domains in strange and disturbing ways. We've got a planetary climate that's in a period of destabilization unprecedented in our recorded history. We are not serving as the appropriate technologically enabled biospheric stewards for that. We are all now perpetually on stage as players in a tracked and surveilled omni-broadcasting world that sees into your brains and chemicals and behavioral profiles in ways that you even can't. We have a situation now where audio and video evidence can be more or less perfectly imitated and invented, so that recordings and pictures no longer prove that anything really happened. We've got a global economic immune system that's so interconnected that we can get mass contaminations of almost every kind very quickly. We've over-optimized international supply lines that are extremely fragile now against inevitable turbulence. And we have unprocessably vast amounts of data on almost everything in a way which makes us more informed and less able to come to grips with any part of our reality. Meanwhile, you can have sex without pregnancy and make children in labs, and they can be genetically edited, and cars are driving themselves, and there's digital brain interfaces, and gravity waves are in play, and the official situation on UFOs is getting extremely ambiguous. Rates of mental illness are spiking. So I'm just trying to point out that we face a real multitude of transformations that are not merely the usual historical rupture where there's a catastrophe or one new technology to deal with. We're facing dozens of new accumulating catastrophes or transformations, each of them capable of changing some very basic aspect of humanity and nature that our ancestors took for granted. The ocean could shut down. Human DNA code can now be changed. These are not things that have happened before in the 200,000 years of anatomically modern human beings. And we ain't seen nothing yet, right? There are also the radical transformative changes, the black swans that we still don't even know enough to worry about. And all of these are capable of interacting with each other in unpredictable ways. So the metacrisis is all of these converging, accelerating, interactive, transformational vectors, accompanied by a mood, a situation that we're already inside and going further and further into, which feels strange, uncanny, dangerous, radical, promising, but operating at scales that we have very difficult time seeing and feeling into, and that our hereditary intuitions didn't necessarily evolve to help us deal with. Now, why is that all one metacrisis and not just a polycrisis? That's a pretty arcane question, but you will hear people asking it. Why is this one meta thing and not just a bunch of things? I think the answer is that these transformational crises are entangled so that they will produce emergent effects that you can't understand merely by looking at them as a collection of crises. They're sourced in a common set of generator functions, which means a few key types of old human software that produce these effects and inhibit our ability to solve them. And I think they require personal and interpersonal metacognition in order to try to solve them. A metanoia is required. So those are some of the reasons why we might think of this as a meta thing. I don't know if anybody here read Dispatches from a Time Between Worlds, which was an anthology I edited for Perspectiva Press with Jonathan Rowson. But I had a concluding essay in that book which proposed that only a Renaissance can solve a metacrisis. This requires a fundamental change in who the people are who are facing this metacrisis. Otherwise, the limitations that are hidden inside our modern or game B or first-tier success strategies will continue to undermine the attempts that we make to solve our problems. So a more inclusive sensibility is required to face a metacrisis. I mentioned the common generator functions. These are the seeds that can contribute to our collective failure to solve these interactive crises. What are these? These underlying problems or programs that produce a metacrisis if you run them long enough? We know a bunch of them. We know that human beings frequently default to simplistic systems that favor reductive zero-sum competition rather than regenerative non-zero-sum collaboration. We know that we're suffering from abandoning a whole plenitude, a whole multitude of crucial natural values by setting up our economic games around single metrics, flat targets like GDP that tend to pervert human enterprise and privilege sociopaths or sociopathically modeled organizational structures. We know that we're not adequately embodied. We know that we're not facilitating left-right brain intelligence harmoniously. Our emotions are reactive. Our attention is unintentional and weak. We haven't accepted the vulnerability and the communication necessary to do real shadow work together. We're vain and hasty and fragile and oversatisfied with our knowledge and our models and fixated in identities, right? We know all of these things. We're blind by virtue of the nature of our hereditary and habitual human nature to a whole bunch of factors, which if you just let them go are going to produce an accumulating crisis, especially if it's empowered with contemporary technology. Sometimes we call those the game A tendencies, the usual nonsense. They've been amplified by modern tools, and so they're now accelerating in a way where if we fail to make sense of them, we could lose everything that we've counted on as a species. So that's the metacrisis. The word just means acknowledging that we're in sort of that position. And I gave a kind of a trippy presentation on the Stoa about this a while ago called amphibious apocalyptarianism, which was the point that that whole situation is extra weird because we don't get to simply acknowledge that we're in some kind of apocalypse. We have the extra weirdness of the fact that it is always both happening and not happening for us. It's amphibious, like a creature that lives in two environments, on the land and in the water, right? So in the age of the metacrisis, there's a mood of inhabiting two different environments of meaning. You get up and you hear that the AIs embedded in Google and Microsoft are hallucinating and going crazy, but you go outside and everything looks pretty normal. Your country's at war, and yet your shiny phones are showing you ads for holographic hip hop stars. Everything is a crisis now, and everything is fine, and we never know if we're panicking too much or not enough. So a big part of the metacrisis is that mood of being in a kind of twilight zone space where we're constantly told that this is a catastrophe, and yet we constantly also have to live as if it's not a catastrophe. So sum up everything that I've been saying, there's a Twilight Zone world historical moment in which the interaction of radically transformative crises have their roots in a common set of psychosocial generator functions that demand a response from an emergent cultural sensibility, that's us, that is capable of collaborative both and feelings, capable of inner practice, capable of getting better at intersubjectivity in multiple states and complementary types of intelligence. And if that cultural sensibility also happens to have a great multidimensional integrative transpluralistic map, so much the better. The meta-modern spirit is rising in response to the meta-crisis and the integrative meta-theory making that Ken Wilber modeled for us, and the communities built around his model and other similar models have important ideas and will play a huge role sense-making at the heart of this crisis and our possibility to face it. So that was a rant. Let's do an absolute quick micro break here and trust that our unconscious minds will remember what I was saying. Let's have everybody touch the top of your head with the forefinger of your left hand. Now, just lightly one touch. Now touch somewhere on your forehead with the little finger of your right hand. Fantastic. Now tap your chest 3 times with any finger on your left hand. Now place your right palm on your left hip, and then place that same right palm on your right knee. It's so simple to forget what we were doing. With any luck, that was a quick mental reset, and everything I told you now belongs to another dimension of our being. So we'll count that as defining the metacrisis more or less. Now, what are the key features of the metacrisis, and what do they collectively tell us, if anything, about the kind of cultural and psychological meta-modern integrative game B response that's needed? Well, here's an interesting thing about the metacrisis. It involves technology that acts like magic. Arthur C. Clarke very famously said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And even when you get used to new tools, there might still be a part of your mind that responds to it like it's sorcery. I mean, are you ever really going to get used to flying robot camera drones that can telepathically communicate information to a pocket computer tool that you can control by talking to it? That's extremely strange. It has the aesthetic outlines of sorcery. Daniel Schmachtenberger and others are fond of this very beautiful idea that we suffer today from a mismatch between archaic emotions, medieval organizational styles, and godlike hypermodern technologies. So that's a situation that's got magic on both ends, because the technology is increasingly like magic, and we're still running some very ancient human forms of feeling and intuition that use something like magic as their primary cognitive operating system. The metacrisis is a moment, they call it a time between worlds, in which our neo-archaic selves are living forward into a science fiction universe that requires, one way or another, that we have some kind of new magical competency, some increase in our ability to inhabit wizardry and embrace and begin to cultivate and refine our deep archaic styles of meaning making. We also see that the metacrisis involves several serious accelerating problems sourced in how we act relative to the self-regulatory, self-generative, super-symbiotic, complex biospheric balance upon which we directly depend. There's behavioral dissonance between the planetary human species and our Gaian survival partner. So we need a new kind of focus on proactively adjusting the human to biosphere relationship. The metacrisis, therefore, needs us both to handle magical situations and work with archaic emotions, and it also requires us to do that in a way that more competently mediates between global nature and the global village. Here's another facet of the metacrisis. We are notoriously fickle as a species when it comes to non-human intelligences. We are harpooning whales and bulldozing the old forests. We have been unreliable partners to the other forms of the organic and systemic intelligences on this planet. We've been rash in producing uncanny machine intelligences, and we seem to be haunted at the edges by some kind of alien or extratemporal or astral weird intelligences that humans keep reporting participatorily. So we need to be able to handle magical realities, archaic feelings, the village-nature relationship, and we need to get more responsible for the interaction between human kinds of intelligence and organic, imaginal, exotic, non-human intelligences. We've been overemphasizing left brain patterning styles, according to Ian McGilchrist, since the invention of written language, particularly since the explosion of the abstract alphabet. And we're seeing all kinds of calls from deep thinkers today, from spiritualists, from philosophers, to amplify our capacity for mystery, holism, paradox, right brain processing styles, unknown patterns, what John Vervaeke would call polyepistemic, what Ken Wilber would call aqual, alternative pluralistic modes of consciousness that we need to be able to fold in. And our ability to do this well and to do it pragmatically is called out by numerous critiques in all the domains of knowledge across the metacrisis. We aren't listening well enough. We're blind in relationship. We've over-adapted our knowledge and belief paradigms to a narrow slice of reality. We're ignoring data from the intuition in the body. We're failing to access supercoherent mystery states. So now, here's what I'm saying. We need to be able to handle magical realities, archaic feelings, readjust the village-nature relationship, be responsible for the interaction of human minds with organic, imaginal, and exotic intelligences, and get much better at right brain modes of mystery beyond our conventional knowledge maps.
Layman, can I jump in for 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead, man.
So this is a hell of an opening. I see a lot of people giggling. But tell me if I have this right. As soon as we enter modern, we're still struggling with the tension between modern and postmodern. And it doesn't really give us the breath to dig deep, as in the case of the shamanism, or to handle the level of complexity, given that, it's pretty good that you're even hitting the metamodern at this point. And some of the postmodern problem is, like Lyotard said, it's the end of a meta-narrative in postmodernism as we try to grasp a comprehensive understanding to deal with this complexity you so well illustrated. Do I have that right?
That's a big part of this, yeah. I mean, we're at a situation where the modern amplification of the things that were problematic in human civilization already has created not only a huge range of complex, dangerous problems, but it's thrown up this postmodern attempt to counterbalance those problems. Unfortunately, that postmodern attempt is usually very modern in the styles it uses, and also tends to be somewhat flat, right? So when we think about different regimes and channels of experience, all of those would have to come into play to make something like a postmodernism that was viable. Right. If you just have postmodernism as a social deconstruction system of intellectual analysis of culture, you don't have very much. But if you had something equivalent in your heart, had something equivalent in your body, had something equivalent in your unconscious, then you'd start to get the possibility of bringing those threads together in a way that we would like to call metamodern. And a lot of that calls back to the things that we think of as being at the starting point of this whole process. There's a kind of twinning that goes on between the emergent age of the metacrisis that is evoking these metamodern needs from us, and the way human beings were situated at the beginning of that last huge transition when we started to be a civilization in the first place. Many of the same problems are facing us. And what I was just doing there by laying out certain facets of the metacrisis was, I think, hopefully very obviously, rhetorically describing the generator functions of the metacrisis as something that is in need of a shamanic skill set, right? So if you start to break down what these facets are, you start ending up with like a job description of something like a shaman. You've got a mental health crisis. You need someone who's good with that. You've got a drug crisis. You need drug wisdom, right? You've got weird, magical, uncanny things. You need people who are good with weird, magical, uncanny things. You've got left brain dominance. You need people who can be good with the right brain. So all of that stuff, as you start to tease apart the tangle of things that make up that metacrisis, you start looking at the job description of something like a shaman. So let's pause there just for a second, do a tiny micro break. Let's take a huge deep breath and hold it for a minute. And while we're holding it, let's do whatever we can to feel it tingling inside us and drink that stimulation more deeply into your body. Whatever you can do to adjust your body to try to pull whatever excitation is in the air more deeply into your cells, and be really grateful for whatever that mysterious extra stimulation that comes along with the oxygen is. And then let it out with some noise. All right. We're getting through this. Only 32 more hours to go. I would like to talk now more directly about the shaman thing, but I don't want to just say shaman. I might say shamanic skill set. I might say the shamanic function. I might say the planetary shaman. I might say the shamanic turn in meta philosophy. Let's take a minute to address the S word before we go any further. What is a shaman? We've all heard about shamanism. I'm not talking about a shamanist. I'm not talking about believers in shamanism. And I'm not primarily talking about a phenomenon that's uniquely linked to inherited traditions and roles within cultural fields that we might today call indigenous or aboriginal. There's a lot of overlap with that, but I'm pointing particularly to a recurrent pattern of human engagement that shows up in various degrees across all epochs and cultures and corresponds loosely to a casual use of the term shamanism. I grew up with that word. I like the sound of it. It makes me feel connected. It generally points at what I'm discussing, but you can feel free to insert any other word you prefer if it does basically the same work. John Vervaeke often uses seer in the Greek sense to mean almost the same thing that I mean by shaman. Another way to say that is that I'm talking specifically not just about shamans, but about the integral shaman, the integrative shaman. And what would that imply specifically? Well, anybody who's familiar with integral models might think first of the pre-trans fallacy. So I'm talking specifically about the archetype of a transrational rather than a pre-rational shaman. It's a bit like talking about biospheric consciousness that is beyond and includes the noosphere, and not the biosphere that is below and included by the noosphere. That's probably too abstract. I probably lost you there. This shamanism is post-conventional, and it was post-conventional in ancient tribes, but we're looking now specifically at the post-conventional shamanism relative to the tribe of the world, to the meta-tribe of tribes that now inhabits the cosmic and planetary lived world. Not the ethnocentric or egocentric or concrete or romantic worlds, the planetary cosmic meta-tribe, that kind of a shaman for that village. So I think what we're interested in is a rational and transrational, spiritually transformational, developmental, multidimensional, ecologically resonant, transcultural, and culturally generative set of Gnostic intermediaries. And I have to say all that because although we have a soft spot for shamanism, at least I do, like I do for Taoism and yoga, there's also an integral critique of the figure of the shaman. So I'm trying to be specific about what I'm talking about in that sense. In the book Up from Eden, our deservedly honored Sir Ken Wilber pointed out a pattern of inner and outer sociocognitive development in which each phase or level of historical complexity had a kind of average level of cognitive complexity and then a leading edge of cognitive complexity. And on this scale, there were primitive, typhonic, and imaginal cultures who embraced some enlightened unity with nature in the gross realm, and they were hovering at a fairly low level, with occasionally getting as far as the neurosomatic centaur subtle awakening. Samuel Bonder, who I love, calls this the period of the hyper-feminine dharmas before the leap into the axial age hyper-masculine dharmas. So what I'm saying is there's a smart conversation in which the evolution of life and spirit is taken to assume that indigenous and prehistorical human cultures were shamanic in the sense of being pre-rational, in the sense of lacking the full complexity of modern and postmodern systems, lacking evolutionary understanding, lacking full non-dual awareness, operating largely through the tools of ethnic superstition to call people to release their limited egos back into an oceanic bliss of pre-separative nature and primitive flow states. So that's a critique that you often hear within developmental fields, that shamanism is a kind of low-level or primitive or regressive model connected to pre-rational modes of magic. So that is not what I'm talking about. You could call that shamanism, and then I would be talking about something other than shamanism. Or you could add a qualifier to the word. I often say planetary shamanism. So there's the pre-trans part of integral. Another thing we have to do to consider shamanism and shamans in an integral sense is that we have to specify what we're talking about developmentally and typologically. So pre-trans is a bit of a developmental lens. Typology is interesting here. There's a question like, is shaman a type? And yes, there are plausible arguments that a certain genetic percentage of the human species fairly constantly experiences subtle flows, entities, unfolding revelations, shaman type motives and interests. That although the shaman deals with things that are pertinent to everyone, the shaman serves the village, they have a particularly amplified interest in and capacity for altered states, ambiguity, complementarity, accuracy, organicity, communication with the non-human, imaginal journeying, improvisational ritual creation, somatic affective flows between and in bodies, etc. There are arguments. The European syntheist philosopher Alexander Bard will make this argument that shamanoids, it's his term, have nervous systems with a greater degree of ambivalence between the different subsystems of the brain, that they are more indifferent to the movement between states of consciousness, and that they recognize something about themselves in borderland places. They're less instinctively attached to social and gender roles. They're often more sensitive, but also less anxious to the difference between appearing normal and appearing unusual, between the familiar and the strange in terms of our stimuli, and between different pools of cultural sense making, between dreaming and waking, and even between different kinds of tribes. So it's important to consider the shaman as a type and as a role, but that's also not the full extent of the situation. It's not just that this is something for a small percentage of people who are instinctively drawn to maximize that skill set in themselves, because cultures where shamans can flourish become shamanically informed cultures. The things that shamans might need to do every day might be things that the other villagers need to do every month or once a year. So there's a membrane there between the shaman and the non-shaman. Not all shamanic things are good for everyone, but that boundary is permeable, it's flexible. There's a little shamanism that needs to be widely distributed. Villagers go to shamans for certain things, certain insights, methods, and ways of being that are needed for particular circumstances that everyone finds themselves in sometimes. So the shamanically informed culture, I think, is one in which the mutually maturing and mutually supportive and diverse shamanic keeners have to constantly renegotiate which aspects of their type of being are needed by and how they are needed in the general population. And the degree of that need typically goes up during conditions of novelty, transformation, and ambiguity, such as we face now. Right? If it's a situation of relatively stable change and the chiefs and the matriarchs can handle it, great, they should handle it. But when conditions are not usual, that's when the general population has to respond to and adapt to more of the tactics that are common among the compulsive multidimensional explorer type. So maybe you're here because you are shamanic. Your odds of being drawn to shamanic behavior is probably higher here than if we were at the State of the Union or a shopping mall or a rally to make America great again or a rally to keep people from making America great again, whatever you're into. On the other hand, maybe you're not here because you feel that typology very strongly in yourself, but you feel it a little and you realize you need to figure out better how to integrate the shamanic type and the shamanic wisdom into a transdisciplinary civilization or into a unified model of psychology. or maybe you just came because you were curious about me or anything else. These are all fine. We don't all need to be shamans any more than we all need to be saints or writers or philosophers or paramedics. We're building a big tent because the metacrisis is big, but at some point, everyone will need something that the shamans have historically specialized in. Micro break. Let's see. Right hand, left knee. Left hand, right knee. Now switch hands. Now switch back. Look all the way to the left and turn your eyes all the way to the right. Look all the way to the right and turn your eyes all the way to the left. Simple enough. Now close your eyes very firmly and check what color you feel goes with the number 2. Okay, now forget everything I was just saying. That was all introduction. Now we're going to zero in on one particular facet of shamanic emphasis, which is ecological consciousness. I'll talk about it for a few minutes and then we'll have a breakout hangout session. So the shaman, and David Abrams' book, The Spell of the Sensuous, is really a great, interesting introduction to this. If you haven't read it, the shaman often lives at the edge of the village. It's a beautiful metaphor. He or she or they or whatever systems are analogous to the shamanic operate in intermediary space, in adjacency, in the borderlands between the anthropological and the ecological, between domestic and wild spaces, between human and non-human domains of patterning. So the shamanic function as much on the world stage as within the ancient regional territory around a small village involves a specialized but largely untutored form of mediation between what strikes us as nature and what strikes us as human. The shamanic character is constantly trying to facilitate a more optimal balance than might randomly occur between those. I say largely untutored. We do want our shamans to be educated. We do need intergenerational transmission and education, but this is a skill set that's not specifically educated as formalized social curriculums. It's sort of something that's built into the species and evoked on a path of dialogos and experimentation and inner work and imaginal exercise, guided primarily by curiosity and deep personal intrigue, although bordered around by feedback from peer groups and some elder transmission input. So what was I saying there? Yes, a more optimal balance between humanity and nature is one of the key areas of concern for the shaman, and one of the reasons why they, in reality, but also metaphorically, inhabit the space at the edge of the village between the social and the ecological. What does a more optimal balance between humanity and nature look like, smell like, feel like? How do we conceptualize it? What's the something that should ideally be maximized when the complex eco-anthropological interaction is mutually supportive, mutually challenging, and optimally generative? One way that I think about that is by teasing apart the meanings of nature and natural, or nature and naturalness. When I do that, I'm making a distinction between the mere fact of nature in all of its wonderful, terrible, and neutral totality, and on the other hand, a special quality that we associate with it or hope from it that I would call naturalness. Nature is super inclusive. It includes even things we don't really want. Nature includes comets wiping out all the species in the biosphere. Nature is mostly a cold, deadly vacuum in all directions, rife with pandemics and predators. So it's the thing, the container, the context that contains everything, doesn't differentiate in a way, undermines or eludes every boundary. It includes both the peacock and the toxic waste, paradise and hell. Nature does not care if everyone you love is alive or dead, and whether or not they suffered unnecessarily. So that's from our point of view, of course, but we invented the word, so we ought to be able to define it in a way that suits us. Now, in distinction from nature, naturalness, also a human construct, connects to a certain range of feelings, socially and neurologically and circumstantially mediated, connects to these feelings of a certain range of patterning styles, connects these feelings and patternings to a range of human well-being outcomes, and to a range of biospheric self-regulating flourishings that skew toward more integrated, more simplex, more integrated complex creatures with more coherent diversities of subjective experience flourishing. That's maybe what you would call an integral definition of naturalness. It's the arrangement of nature that facilitates the maximum unfolding of creatures that have more depth and more integrated complexity. A set of what Ken Wilber would call a tetra-arising set of configurations, where there's subjective, objective, intersubjective, and systemic dimensions that allow for best fit affordances of multi-state well-being for depth-oriented creatures who exist now and who we would like to contribute to the leading edge existence of in all foreseeable futures, including every other arrangement on which those are based. So it's an artistry. Naturalness is an artistry that combines the human and the ecological in a way that favors what Wilber called the greatest depth for the greatest span. And I will argue that we come with an instinct for aesthetics that corresponds to that systemic optimization, that we're a part of nature with a certain kind of evaluation built into us to help allow for our participation in that kind of an outcome. And this instinct can be circumstantially cultivated, also co-opted, also degenerative, just like any other part of our biophysical inheritance. But my point here with all these caveats and semantic precautions is to say that there is something like naturalness that we can use as a rough metric to gauge whether or not nature is operating as the human point of view and as nature interacting in a way that has benevolent correlates in all quadrants, and for which the shamanic function must take responsibility in all quadrants for cultivating this desirable and useful multidimensional form of depth-oriented human and ecological interaction. It's a bit extraordinary in a way, but also plausible to suggest that we have this built-in capacity to detect naturalness in a way that's meaningful. But if you know anything about the field of neuroaesthetics, you'll know there's been some studies showing that rats oddly prefer an elongated representation of a piece of cheese to a more realistic piece of cheese that they've also figured out that they can eat. Their brains prefer the stylized version to the one that's objectively accurate to their experience. They have brains just like we do, and we also prefer a certain kind of stylation in our experience. We're flexibly wired to prefer a certain privileged set of configurations and the accompanying affects that go with those configurations. So most human brains that are studied tend to have a preference for pastoral landscapes over garbage dumps, for tropical islands over gray urban blocks. And some of that's obviously because we associate certain survival advantages with certain visual triggers. But there's also a kind of innate structural aesthetics that favors the patterns that evoke a combination of biodiversity and restorative feelings and interactive opportunities. These patterns are not arbitrary. Systems and complex sciences will tell us that certain specific ratios of connectivity to isolation, of order to chaos, of permeability to self-defense optimize for complex intelligent operations in adaptive niches, including the operation of developmental unfolding. So sapient beings did not evolve on this planet where the ecological challenge was too extreme or where the social environment deviated too far from the ecology. There's a sweet spot where the sapient evolution can occur, a range that makes more developmental outcomes more likely. So the story that I'm telling is roughly that humanity and nature need to creatively integrate in order to produce naturalness or naturalistic outcomes, that this is ethical and practical and aesthetic and spiritual, and that it points us directly to certain styles of intervention in the constantly emerging set of overlapping anthropogenic ecological crises, such as climate destabilization, cascading biodiversity die-offs, collapse of the marine ecosystem, broken watersheds, degraded soil, all that stuff. The earth is fine. Nature is fine. What's in jeopardy is the naturalness that is most deeply detected as valuable by human beings in proportion to the degree of their sensitivity and comprehensiveness and direct exploratory immersion in ecologically situated flow states. So I'm saying again from a different angle that the situation requires something like shamans, but at a new scale with an integrative worldview, and I think in greater numbers than before. We need maybe 1 million or 10,000 at least really competent, diverse neo-shamanic facilitators from every kind of cultural and temperamental background to really foreground an integrative ecological situation where these integrative ecological bodhisattvas put natural beauty, natural truth, natural goodness, natural fitness as a noospheric and biospheric partnership at the heart of whatever developmental and transformational approach we use. So the kind of shamanism I'm talking about, this integrative shamanism, is something that has to be uncovered and evolved and unfolded within any kind of traditional background. It's no good if you have an integral Christianity that neglects the environment. It's no good if we have meta-aware stages or politically active Buddhism or contemplative cognitive science if these are neglecting to prioritize the mutually adaptive, developmentally open coherence of a diverse life world. So when we talk about integral shamanism, it's not just the forms we associate with the traditional cultures or the psychotherapeutic context of entheogens, although both those are in play. It's something that can and needs to inhabit any and every tradition. All the spiritual and religious and developmental and wisdom cultivation paths descend historically from shamanic progenitors, and all of them today and tomorrow, in my view, need to reinvigorate the shamanic emphasis on human participation in regenerative ecology as being at the heart of the manifestation of their praxis and their faith. The ancient role of the shaman as a generator of pro-social customs and ethics for the well-being of the community has always had a strong ecological theme, and today that has to emphasize preparedness and regenerative ethics for adaptively optimizing something like developmental naturalness, and it has to be able to do that from within any code, any tradition, any operating system, any language. Let's see. I was going to say something about how naturalness operates in each of the quadrants, but in order to get a little caught up on time here, I think maybe we'll just go something like the breakout. Let's say I've been laying out some ways of thinking about how we foreground the natural and our shamanic responsibility to the natural in integral terms. For most of us, though, it's much more basic than that. It's about starting to privilege and explore and communicate and innovate around our connection between development, meaning, and ecology in our own lives. How do we personally and interpersonally situate ourselves between development, meaning, and ecology, and make sure that those are deeply connected together rather than things that can be pursued in isolation from each other? So the breakout room proposal that I'm going to mention here is that we take, say, 15 minutes to settle down and get to know each other in a way that's on theme. So here's the proposal. In a room of 5 people, let's take turns speaking for a couple of minutes about an experience that we've had of the sacred or the developmental or the hyper meaningful that occurred to us in nature. Right? The vast majority of human religious, spiritual, and developmental life took place before the existence of buildings, before the existence of writing. And a lot of it still takes place in nature. We often call it recreation now, which is a great term, recreation. So did you ever have a peak experience while camping, flow state or altered consciousness in the woods, in the water, with an animal, with the sky, with the sun, with the earth? I'd love us to just take a few minutes and try to say what happened and how that felt and what it was like for you to be in a deeply meaningful or transformative condition in an ecological context. If you've ever felt anything wholly in tandem with ecology, try to say that. And if you've never felt anything wholly in connection with ecology, well, you can take this opportunity to say that too. So maybe we'll go to the breakout room now and meet back up here in about 15 minutes.
Layman, I typed something into the chat. I hope I captured pretty well what you said, but let's double check.
I put something as well, Kathy, and
Yeah.
the Zoom hasn't been moving stuff from the chat into the breakout room. So if you want either Kathy's comment or mine, cut it and then paste it when we open up the breakout room.
Give like a thumbs up when you've done something along those lines. So you're ready. All right. I've got the room set up. The room with Layman's got 6 people, but just because the number, so that was how the numbers worked out. See you back in 15 minutes.
Breakout sessions are not recorded.
Well, I hope everybody got enough time to chill out or be self-expressive or hear with their conscious and their subconscious mind, something about other people's experience of what it's like to find the sacred and the deeply meaningful in nature and in naturalness. What I want to do now is pivot to speak about the subconscious, but I wanted to sort of segue to it through the notion of elemental powers. Because elemental powers are ways that human beings enter into psychoactive dialogue or embodied poetic relationship with the basic experiential categories of nature. So we don't mean elements in the sense of tungsten and titanium. We mean earth, air, metal, water, fire, those kind of things. And as savvy, modern, educated humans, we have an unfortunate habit of assuming that symbols are purely representative, that water means fluidity or harmony or purification or receptivity or something like that. And it's not dumb to think that. That's wonderful, but it risks overlooking something more basic that I think would have stood out very clearly to our less conceptually educated ancestors. And that is that the elementals are also direct participatory injunctions. What does water mean? It means go in the water, put your head under a waterfall, splash the river on your face. What does fire mean? It means make a fire, smell the smoke, feel the woods, watch the psychedelic forms flickering inside the candle flames. So these embodied experiences, especially where we lean into their intensities with intentionality, have the ability to restore our vitality, to deepen our understanding of the world, and even to communicate new insights and practices. They don't speak verbally to our conscious minds, but they can speak implicitly to our subconscious in surprising ways. If anyone knows the origin story of rebirthing, what they call conscious circular breathing now, it occurred to Leonard Orr spontaneously during sensory deprivation in his homemade flotation tank. And if you're familiar with the origin story of Wim Hof's remarkable ability to overcome viral infections and freezing temperatures, you'll know that it involves a mindset and a breathing technique that he says the ice taught him. So these are psychotechnologies that were spontaneously evoked from out of the subconscious during immersive intentional exposure to elemental intensities. That's pretty interesting. It's pretty shamanic. Sometimes nature is the yogi, and the yogi is not writing books or making articulate arguments, but rather she's eliciting new behavioral capacity through nonverbal exchanges between the embodied subconscious intelligence of the organism and the depth of sustained experiential contact with elemental forces, particularly elemental forces in particular places. And anybody who's spent time exploring the wilderness knows there are spots where you kind of get high, where you see and feel things differently, and where new impressions and even new knowledge start to bubble up as though the particular configuration of the place were whispering to you. When I work with people like John Vervaeke, who are very focused on the role of dialogue in the production of insight and wisdom, I'm always speaking for and very attentive to the need for nature and place to be treated, at least imaginally, as interlocutors who can enter into these conversations with us. There's a passage that John quoted from Plato's Phaedrus in his recent After Socrates series, which I recommend, where Socrates is describing himself as an amateur seer, another way of pointing out the shamanic function, and he says that it is as if he hears a voice coming from the place. He speaks of the place as the form in which he receives suggestions from hidden, nonlinear, non-conscious aspects of his own intelligence. So that's where I'd like to turn to the subconscious, to a subconscious turn in philosophy, so to speak. How does subconscious intelligence show up in shamanic practice? First thing we notice is, on the one hand, we have all of this neurophysiological data suggesting that most of our intelligence is non-conscious and operates as though it were an other or others relative to our own psyche. And we've come to believe that our ancestors adaptively and heuristically worked out ways of dealing intelligently with pragmatic physical and social realities in ways that they did not propositionally understand. That their genius was not primarily in consciously recognizing accurate facts about the world and coherently speaking about them to each other and implementing them tactically. That's a very modern notion of knowledge. Their genius seems to have been largely about learning to do things that allowed them to do other things, even if they didn't understand what they were doing. And all of the animals and plants do amazing things without consciously knowing how and what they're doing, it seems. Now, on the other hand, we have integral and other developmental wisdom communities capable of integrative pluralism, transrationality, diunital both and thinking, construct awareness, all these great things. And these communities and discourses are often highly informed by developmentally oriented spiritual traditions and new thought experiments where people are very focused on consciousness, layers of consciousness, the need to become more conscious, the possibility that everything is conscious, or that the eros of evolution is navigating toward the becoming conscious of the universe itself. How do we bring together our profound shamanic facility and scientific and psychoanalytic and artistic fascination with the unconscious, and our spiritual, integrative, and developmental fascination with consciousness? So the first thing we might do there is tease apart consciousness from the waking state personality. Very often these terms are conflated. We say that someone is conscious when their eyes are open. They're not asleep or dreaming. They're sitting up and walking around. They can officially register a limited range of sensory perceptions where they identify objects and communicate about social facts with other human beings. Maybe predominantly in beta waves. Maybe they can tell you their name and the date and who's president right now. That's part of the pragmatic and legal definition of consciousness. But when you talk with people about altered state experiences, or their cosmological intuitions, or their impressions of the teachings of great sages, they tend to use consciousness in another way, in a strange way. People will say you're still conscious or can be conscious in your dreams, that when you're in dreamless sleep, you're nothing but pure consciousness, that some kind of quasi-witnessing function pervades all levels of reality, that even a single prehensive cell in your body or a single quark in the heart of a neutron in the heart of an atom has at least a little bit of consciousness. And that if we practice mindfulness enough, we will activate our true consciousness that is one with the consciousness of all things. Now, what's interesting about all of that phrasing is that consciousness is being described as something that's fairly unconscious, right? The consciousness of the cosmos, of the cells, of other layers of our own psychology, these things are not salient in the waking state. So most of what we're pointing to with the elaborate versions of consciousness is not what individual human beings are aware of right now. It's not concentrated in the sensory and social personality that answers the phone and can tell other people what you saw on the news. So whatever the word consciousness is pointing to in developmental and spiritual circles is at best adjacent to waking state sensory and cognitive experience. And it might be more accurate to call it subconscious or paraconscious or extra-conscious. So there might be a lot to learn, I would say, from de-emphasizing the conventional notion of consciousness in integrative and spiritual practice communities, and instead paying a little bit more attention to the fact that that is pointing toward things that fall outside of the waking state mind, things that we might otherwise call surreal or magical or shamanic, artistic and dreamlike, embodied and distributed, things we can participate with, but which show up to us as if they were other than our conscious knowledge. People who like the idea of multiple lines of intelligence often note, as they do in integral theory, that the cognitive line goes first. They mean that it's very hard to have an emotion about or a moral response to something if you can't first recognize or detect that it exists. So there's a certain kind of knowing that's presupposed by other skills or talents. But the problem with that phrasing is that it implies or tends to imply that the conscious intellect, the official recognizing function of the mind, is somehow the central agent of our unfolding, that it's the one that's doing the knowing that goes first. And that doesn't sound quite right if most of our intelligence is unconscious and embodied and participatory and heuristic. We don't want to get trapped in the game of trying to name and know everything first before getting engaged with it. It's engagement that allows the majority of the organism to evolve and understand how to work with the patterns of the world that we're interested in. And in most cases, the socially self-aware waking state mind doesn't have to know about that. Like the rest of the organisms, we have evolved to do things and only occasionally to see them and know about them and be able to say them. And most of our great sages, even if we suggest that they are savants of consciousness, seem to be very focused on mystery, on the intelligence of unknowingness, and the paradoxes beyond knowledge, about the mind that our mind cannot comprehend. So, a very interesting inquiry that people can stand in front of is to ask what spirituality, even what something like integrative developmental complexity looks like if your subconscious is the primary agent who is doing the evolving through stages, if we accept stages. What is it like if it's the subconscious that moves through levels of growth that are relatively independent of what you can know about your values and worldview, relatively independent of your self-reflective capacity? And what if the consciousness and the whole identity and set of capacities that are with you in the waking state are not who you are, but more like the assistant or the secretary or the butler to who you are, an assistant who can do a good job when they know they're the assistant, but might do a poor job if they think they're acting primarily on their own? And what do our developmental and collaborative psychotechnologies look like if the conscious self presumed itself to be the diligent helper to the actual intelligence? And of course, that starts to look and feel very shamanic. One of the most obvious shamanic access points to the subconscious is trance. So in casual spiritual circles, it's often fashionable to denigrate trance states as if they represent the foolish dream of life from which we must awaken into clarity. But obviously, psychotherapists recommend trance states for many kind of self-knowledge and self-transformation. Trances are essential in art and athletics, and they form a great deal of our received impression of how culture and healing and psychological growth were undertaken in ancient indigenous communities. When we think of their shamanic interactions with trance states, we tend to think of things like trance drumming, trance dancing, trance facilitating plants. And I should probably say a few words about plants because there's a great deal of legitimate interest in powerful healing non-toxic entheogens, particularly from the tryptamine family, such as those found in psilocybin mushrooms and ayahuasca brews. The capacity of these substances to elicit positive lifestyle changes, to evoke religious experiences, to alleviate depression, to improve our sense making, maybe even to produce new neurons. These are extremely impressive things, and they should be of interest deeply to a more shamanically informed civilization. But it's also easy to overly associate prominent psychedelic plants with the larger, more diverse field of human shamanic practice and trance induction. I think a broad survey of shamanic traditions reveals that while highly potent, mind-altering substances are present in some areas, all the peoples eat plants and do various things to lubricate trance states. The human is an omnivorous nibbler. We're always readjusting the anthropological and ecological balance in our minds simply by foraging, by taking more kinds of things from the ecosystem into the body and into the brain, often just little bits. Just to smell or to rub or to taste things from our local ecosystem is tremendously informative to our subconscious and tends to produce very small altered states, not the kinds of elaborate altered states we've come to associate with high-dose psychedelic compounds. Many of the plant substances used by shamans traditionally are not things we would even normally think of as being psychoactive. They don't induce wild journeys. They produce a slightly abnormal state in which subtle impressions and curious forms of focus are more salient than they are usually. Sometimes I make a joke that the modern person expects an orgiastic or televisual meltdown as if they were taking a spoonful of LSD at a Grateful Dead concert, and they might be shocked when they go into the shaman's tent and get a single puff of tobacco or a handful of wild parsley. So it's not always meant to blow your mind. That's good sometimes, but most of the time, the use of plants seems to have meant a shift into a slightly adjacent region of the psyche, into the borderland between the conscious and the unconscious intelligence. And of course, this is true of all other kinds of trance work as well. People who haven't undergone hypnosis and only seen it in films might be anxious that their mind will be taken away completely, but in reality, you stay present in the trance. It can be very subtle. You might not even understand you were in an altered state until you reflect on it later. So shamanic wisdom does present ordeals, but its primary function involves the cultivation of subtler experience and subtler capacity in the borderlands between what we would call conscious and unconscious. Let me see, how much time do I think we have if we're going to have some Q&A here? I think we should probably go to another breakout session and come back and do Q&A. And the kind of breakout session I have in mind is something that tries to work a little bit more directly with the space between the conscious and the unconscious mind. Everybody here, maybe most of the people here, are familiar with this emerging culture of trying to make intersubjective we spaces emerge. They're Bohemian dialogue and circling and synchronizing our breath and sharing our the tip of our tongue emotional vulnerabilities and aspirations. These are all really good things. But one of my regular critiques is that we are overweighted toward consciousness in these practices. It's both easier for most people to retrieve inner content that makes sense to them, and it's often socially awkward to articulate things that we can't justify. So we try to be authentic in our check-ins. We try to include feelings as well as ideas. We try to stay with what's arising in the moment. But if you listen to groups that are doing this, they're almost exclusively using words that make sense to them. They're not going closer to that shamanic edge of the unintelligible, and this might impose a structural limitation on the degree of intersubjective resonance that can be achieved. We're narrowing these options down to the window of consciousness and only minimally engaging with the hidden majority of our intelligence that might seem irrational or nonsensical or peculiar. So I'm going to suggest that for this breakout, we collaboratively experiment generating a small shared field together based in nonlinear or transrational communication. What I would suggest is we go around the circle and keep going around with as much time as we have. But what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we don't share anything that makes sense to us. That's going to be the one rule. Maybe you're expressing yourself, maybe you're responding to the whole session or responding to what the others are saying. Anything's fine, but don't share anything that you get. If you think you can see why you thought of it, then release that and look for something else, something that feels right, but seems unconnected. Let's hear each other contribute surrealistically. Maybe it's glossolalia, maybe it's gibberish, maybe it's a free association that's way too free. But some part of you is like the craziness of nature, like the nature that created the star-nosed mole or stick bugs or fractals or the self-moving elf kingdom that's inside the cells of the brain. So maybe we can all give that a try and report back afterwards. I'll go around and share and try to make sure your sharing doesn't make sense to you. Take that risk with each other. So our group had a fun little experience and an interesting discussion following that experience. Curious about what other people went through, but also I think this is maybe time to move into some Q&A and move toward the end of the official session. I know there's going to be some announcements in 10 minutes or so, but is there a protocol for the Q&A? Or do I just say the names of people I see with their hands raised?
Yeah, go ahead and call on them, Layman.
I unmuted Sandy. So go ahead, Sandy, you were first.
Yeah, I saw Sandy first.
Good, thanks. I just wanted to share an interesting resource connected to some of what you were discussing. There's this institution called the Foundation for Shamanic Studies that was founded by Michael Harner, who is an anthropologist that did very deep dive explorations of the existing shamanic experiences throughout the second half of the 20th century, and then founded this institution that is a very interesting place because it does feel like what you were talking about is what he calls core shamanism, not shamanism embedded in particular cultures, but he took the essence of what he saw was similar across all the cultures, and he went all over the world and called it core shamanism. And the foundation is both an academic resource. They've done a lot of studies. do articles, do a lot of teaching, and in some ways very focused on manifesting somewhat of what you were speaking about.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for bringing that resource up for us. I see Marie's hand.
I'm just curious if in the groups people said words. Our group did not say words because I don't know, for me it seemed like once you said a word, it was a word. So I'm just curious if how people did that within the group. And then I wanted to thank you especially for using your words so well to lay out this whole topic, which was amazing, totally amazing. So thank you.
Thanks. Our group had a mixture of words and gibberish. One of the things I noticed for myself was I switched partway through to trying to articulate images that came to me that didn't make any sense. And so for that, I tended to use more clear on the words. I see Phyllis's hand.
Thanks. John Vervaeke talks a lot about serious play, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that in terms of shamanism.
Sure, and I mean, serious play is the classic, let's say the primordial form of human education. It's how most of the animals develop. It's how most of our own development takes place. The thing about shamanism, I think more so than some of the other traditions, is it makes it very obvious because you are, a lot of role playing is going on and a lot of role switching is going on in shamanic practice. You're becoming animal and you're venturing into edge spaces and things like that. Or like the experiment we were just doing, you're straying to the edges of what consciousness can find as well. And when you've got something locked down in your propositional knowledge mind, it's very easy to start taking it too seriously for it to be playful and kind of over reifying this division between seriousness and play. And when you stray more into the shamanic territory, the differentiation between them becomes blurry. And I think that's where a lot of that can come to the fore, especially if you're modified in your state of consciousness slightly, right? Whether it's by ingestion of a substance or by a meditative practice or a dance or drumming, whatever it is, it gets you into a slightly different place in yourself where normal behavior becomes subtler and more playful, but also in some ways more complex. When you stay playfully at the edge of your own complexity, that's where your maximum amount of learning and development seems to take place. Larry.
I'm a fan of that edge between the ineffable and the effable. What's maybe wanting to come into language, the higher into the lower, for lack of a better way of saying that, or the meaningless to come into the meaningful. In this particular exercise, the first thing that came out of me was, I wouldn't call it a gibberish. It sounded more like maybe, I don't know, a language. I had a sense as to what I was saying through it, but it was sort of it almost sounded like Native American to me as I heard it coming up. And then I tried to just play with just being in the meaninglessness, but nothing would come out if I just stayed in the meaninglessness. The left brain was sort of just offline for languaging. So the closest I could get to it was to go in the left brain to try to articulate being in the meaninglessness, which was pretty meaningless, I guess, in a meaningful kind of way. I don't know. And I noticed for me anyhow, after maybe about 10 minutes, my functional brain wanted to keep coming online and not to continue hanging out of meaninglessness, because it just goes on forever. It can go on forever. And And then I would try to get into, okay, is there a functionality in being in meaninglessness? As opposed to being at that borderland of the ineffable and the effable, which is sort of a different process for me than it was doing your exercise. If that makes sense. I think you understand what I'm saying. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a couple of different shamanic skill sets that are involved, right? One is sort of building up the daring and the capacity to go deeper and deeper into particular states. The other is to be able to occupy and oscillate at the boundary. And then still a third one is to be able to reflect upon or get some kind of different hybridization between those two states. And that one in particular, I think, goes to your first point, which is the possibility of a deep intrinsic grammar or syntax within the things that we think are nonsensical, as if there was a language structure prior to the language we learn. Terence McKenna, a great shamanic voyager from the last century, did a lot of work on trying to evoke the implicit syntax that he felt was inherent in shamanic states prior to learned human language systems. And I think there's a lot we still have to learn about the underlying grammar of proto-language. I see Cheryl's hand.
Hi, so I'm on the North Shore of Ontario's smallest lake. And I often get into that, is it the hypnagogic state, like between awake and sleeping? And I'm wondering if there's ways of working with that state or things that you might recommend when I find myself there.
Yeah, that's a very, very beautiful space where the images start to become very realistic. And I think that a lot of our ancestors, based on what they've left us, appear to have been creating spaces for themselves in order to feel that. I mean, if you go deep into a cave in the darkness, you're going to be working with those things. But I think one of the things we want to do is see if we can enter into some kind of communication or dialogue with these forms as they come up. It's very easy to sort of take them as an interesting aesthetic phenomenon. But yeah, that's what I would say, is try to make contact, try to make communication, try to stabilize one of them and have a dialogue with it.
Thank you.
The other thing, of course, is to try to hold one in your mind and come out of that state and then depict it somehow, right? Which is one of the other things that famously the very early shamanic archaeological leavings we have involve people making these images on cave walls and things like that, that presumably came out of their hypnagogic reverie in those spaces. So they're finding those shapes and then they're trying to concretize them, a little bit like what Larry was saying about the reflective functional mind looking back at those right brain states. So maybe you want to make imagery or a fetish or a structure or something like that that depicts these structures and gives them a portal into this world, so to speak, at least in your own feeling about them.
Right.
I'm saying that Tom has his hand up. I'm also saying that it's 8:57. These things might be connected. But I'm also not hearing his voice.
I mean, you already mentioned the role of play. And one of the things I'm aware of talking with you is how quickly we lapse into silly. This thing I always loved about you. And does silly have some of those crusty edges that would otherwise not emerge? Is it a way of opening what isn't traditionally in the stream of consciousness?
Silliness is one of the flavors. And I think you have to be able to explore that flavor. I mean, there's a reason we think of little kids as being silly. The states that they find are extremely fertile in terms of development, right? It's very interesting to think about who's the fastest developer in the human system, right? If we think of human beings as adults, that maybe if you're lucky, you spend 5 or 10 years going through a bunch of practices and go up a half a step in terms of your own experience. But we look at little kids and they are zooming through stages. It's really remarkable. And so a lot of what they're doing has to be based in things that strike the adult brain as being too silly to indulge in. We would be interested, I think, in all the different flavors of things that we're placing just outside the rung of our ordinary consciousness. That's where we're going to be able to bring things in to enrich that consciousness. Silly is one of those flavors. John Vervaeke talks about how sometimes the terrifying can be one of those flavors too. There's a lot of things around there, but definitely silly is one of the best for us and one of the ones we see most often in healthy young members of our own species.
Okay, I'm going to close out our meeting here. So we'll come back to Charlie after we do the announcements. So I want to thank Layman. That was amazing, and the time went so fast. It was just so much to reflect on and to take in, and a lot of fun too. So thank you, Layman, and also want to put in a I don't know what your best website is, but I have your Substack. I'll put that in.
Sure,
the
Substack's good.
And also our next month meeting is, we don't have it on the website yet, and we haven't announced it in the meetup, but it's available in the meetup. We're going to have Steve McIntosh, and Steve McIntosh is he's an amazing guy, and he's written a book on integral politics, and we don't have his topic yet, but I assume it's going to be something on the integral politics. And that's April 8th, so it's early in April. That is the second Saturday. So we'll have that up as soon as we get some more info. And then in May, we've got Karen Voorhees. Is Karen still here?
Yes.
Yeah, Karen, do you want to give us a
Yes.
brief synopsis of what you're going to do in May?
My topic I'm working on is fun with eros and agape with breakout groups.
Okay. So that's in the meetup as well, and we'll fill those both out. So we have the San Diego Integral org, so that's where you can find out. We don't have the event posted there yet. We'll have that as soon as we get some more info, and you can make the donation there as well. And we're going to move into our informal chat segment now. So I want to thank all of those of you who came and can't stay for that. But if you can, yeah, share an insight from today's session and let us know how it went for you, or ask more questions for Layman. Yeah, thank you, Joanne. Charlie, do you want to go?
Yeah. So, I haven't been to this group before, and I'm glad I joined today. But I have been working, because of my own lived experience, I started recognizing some of the, stuff going on in our environment that causes us to be so disconnected from one another, and like trauma, and so I got involved with trauma research and psychedelics, and in helping people heal trauma. And I just feel this burning, to do something, about it, because it's not escaping me, the trajectory we're on, and I can't seem to lay that to rest. And, it's not exactly a popular topic to bring up. And with most people can't weather the conversation. And I find myself kind of at a loss to make change, because I feel like some of that communication about what's going on, you have to make it palatable to other people, and so I just don't know where I fit in it. And yet I feel this burning that I have to do something about it. So I just kind of wonder your thoughts.
Yeah, that's huge, because there's so many traumatized people. and intergenerational trauma coming down to us. And now there's this additional factor that the world is becoming so uncanny that that itself can be like a trauma to people. There are lots of opportunities to help people, you know, one-on-one or with psychedelics or other kinds of therapies and things like that. But you have to be able, I think, fundamentally to provide a context where people know that's what they're coming for. And then they're much more likely to open up to it, because although these are topics that many people don't want to discuss, they're topics that everybody lives with. And most people secretly hope that there's a space where they can explore these things and talk more frankly about them in a way that's healing. And because you can't help everybody, what you can do is be more proactive and more overt in creating contexts or spaces where people can come specifically for that. And you'll probably get people who are the people that you could be helpful to.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, I think I was up next, so I'll just jump in. Layman, thank you. I knew this was going to be fun and awesome and wonderful. This is like listening to a magnificent jazz riff in some smoky nightclub, and you go out just transformed. Anyway, thank you. Apropos of about 5 minutes back or so, you talked about the term silly, and silly as one of the modes of approaching the shamanic. And what came up in me was the etymology of silly. It's cognate with the German word selig, which means holy. So silly and holy have the same root in our common Germanic languages. And with that came the association of the clown or the trickster. In a lot of the early communities, that the clown, the trickster, was supposed to do things differently, kind of like we were doing in our group when we were speaking things that didn't make sense. There's some need, some calling in us to turn things around and upside down and be silly, and that's a way to connect with something more deeply meaningful. So I just wanted to toss that in.
That's nice. I didn't know that etymology. I think the other thing silly does for us, of course, is that it provides the opportunity to relax. And that's really important if we're going to show up with more dimensions of our being. I see that Susan has her hand up. Although I don't know if I'm supposed to be calling that out anymore. We're in a casual hangout session.
I was struck by the definition that we have for the construct-aware stage, which is magician and which allows for shape-shifting, and certainly for humor and light-hearted self descriptions, with not taking yourself so darn seriously. It seemed there are some parallels here between what you were talking about and what we found just by looking at developmental in the traditional way. Or do you think that's fundamentally different?
No, I think they're very similar. And I think that like in Mircea Eliade's research, it seemed like what they discovered was that very often the shaman was the most developed and most experienced character in the tribe, which was the opposite of what Freud had anticipated when he viewed them as psychologically broken down people. So I think we will continue to see that the people that have the set of qualities that we associate with the shamanic temperament, if they succeed rather than burn out, because there's a lot of risks to being a person born with those temperaments. But if they succeed, they're more likely to move into the post-conventional ranges of development within any social context. And I think that's because specifically that they're very good at those trickster magician-like skills that start to really become emphasized as you move further along that developmental trajectory.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Because you have to very essentially, like, in the Keegan sense of, you know, the subject becoming the object of the new subject. And one of the ways to facilitate that is just the classic kind of mindfulness practices that are pursued in Buddhism. Those are practices where you are in a relational threshold between yourself and the contents of your identity. So you're not just inside, but you're not dissociated from it. You're in that in-between space. So that in-between space to the contents of the self and the roles that the self are playing is essential to ongoing development. And the more of that development you've done, the more obviously that fact stands out about you, that you play back and forth across the definitions of the self.
Beautiful. Yes, thank you.
Yes, well, I'm going to go ahead and just popcorn in unless one of the organizers wants to call for more formal hand raising. But Suzanne, I've to the degree I am familiar with your stage model and the construct aware, and of course Ken Wilber's developmental model. My sense of the shaman in both early indigenous tribes and what meta shamans today is that there's always been some route all the way through into what we might call transcendent states of consciousness, that once we're open to those what non-physical senses, the subtle senses, that we can travel all the way up, all the way down, all the way up, all the way down, and that people with the shamanic openness to those subtle energies can go all the way up into what second and third tier, as Ken Wilber would say. Now you can really go off the rails with that, but I'm kind of rambling here because I'm trying to pull a few things together. That what we're saying here is doing for me is that to be in the construct aware stage, like an integral shaman or somebody who has kind of gone up the column of the beam of light into these transrational states of awareness, that there is a lived experience of being one with some larger force, some larger love, the creative force. And Gebser, of course, taking the Gebser course with Jeremy Johnson for the third time, because Gebser was speaking from that place. And once one has experienced that personally, not just read about it, but experienced, there's kind of a cosmic, well, Gebser used the term Urvertrauen, a primal trust, that in spite of all the catastrophe and the meta-catastrophe, that there is some larger essence that is love, that is creativity, that is all the things the saints talk about. And even just a small bit of that experience gives us a sense in our lived normal daily lives where we're not so overwhelmed by the catastrophe and the meta-catastrophe, where we can have that sense of what, call it our Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it. But that, and the shape, that's where the shape shifting comes from. And there is a sense of ease and a relaxation, and which if I, to the degree I understand these, and I'm kind of aligning it now with the construct aware stage in your system, Suzanne, that then when we're back in our normal states of awareness and not in some shamanic trance, that brings that Urvertrauen, that primal trust, some of it comes back with us and helps us be more centered and present in our daily lives and dealing with daily life and then with the occasional catastrophe. Anyway, that's kind of rambling, but some of those pieces just came together for me just now listening to you and Layman.
What comes up for me there, Karen, is the range of things that are necessary to support a healthy ongoing development in the shamanic character, right? Because there are shapeshifters who don't get the benefit of the kind of experience you were describing, just like there are people who have these capacities but don't grow up in situations where there are enough social supports for them to develop self-regulation, to have the emotional capacity to be with others. There's a long history of broken quasi-shamans littered throughout human history. So we have to be very careful and intelligent, I think, to try to set up the conditions under which shamanic culture can reestablish itself in the world, because we've got a lot of people who have incredible sensitivities and incredible predilections to go into different kinds of states and to explore different realms of the human experience. And we absolutely need the discoveries that they're making. But if many of them are crashing and burning, if there's no community of them to inform and support each other, if there's no eldership and intergenerational transmission to help them turn out well, then we're going to get a huge battlefield of the flaming carcasses of the pseudo shamans that aren't going to be very helpful to the rest of us.
Yes, amen. And this is number one, why we need to be doing our shadow work all along. And I have to say, so much of what's happening in these sorts of circles today reminds me of the human potential movement in the 70s. There were a lot of bodies on the rocks back then too. And so maybe we can be a bit wiser as we go at this again now in the current round.
You talked about things changing and transforming and all the lists that you went through at the beginning. And R.J. Stewart, if anybody's familiar with him, who is a teacher from Scotland, fairy tradition. He's written many, many books, done a lot of study, worked with the fairies and the nature realm. He's giving a talk tomorrow about how magic is changing. Magic itself is changing, which I think is just in line with what you were talking about. That whole realm, it's not like everything is staying the same. It's all in flux. So I'll be curious to see what he says about that. I'll report in if I hear anything great. It's a salon that he's giving, and it's already all set up, but I'll be curious to see. And then the other thing.
Oh, could you put a link in that? While we're on?
You know, the salon is set up. It's they use GoToMeeting, and it's all set up already. So, but I'll check in with what he says. He's writing a book called The Further Path, which is about working with the nature and energies in a new fashion. So it should be interesting. And then the other thing I want to say is, I loved how you called us back to the body during your talks, because I think really the heart space anybody can access, no matter where they are. It's kind of like giving everybody a teddy bear. You know, people, I used to travel, when I traveled, I always traveled with teddy bears because they always made people smile. They always, you know, everybody relates to a teddy bear, in my experience, positively. So I loved how you called us back to the body. So thank you. I'm going to go eat my dinner.
I just have to say, Marie, before you go, that teddy bear sounds both silly and Selig holy.
Right. When I was in the hospital, that's the first thing I told my husband to bring me a teddy bear. And then when all the nurses and the doctors would come in, they'd all like talk to this teddy bear. It was great. It was great. Anyways, thank you everybody so much.
Thank you, Marie.
Thanks, Marie.
Layman, I'd like to ask a question about this shamanistic approach to activism, because there's so many ways we can come into activism, like through anger or fear, or, you know, through love. Yeah, could you say a little about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different levels at which one could be doing that. I think if we're thinking about the mood that we bring into it, I think there's a sense of relating to the magic and the strangeness of the world and the fact of the non-human intelligences that we're trying to get into a dialogue with, so that we're not just the helpers of the inert system, that we're somehow in a deeper conversation with that system as part of our activism. Also, depending on how we individually feel about subtle energies and fields and all that kind of thing, there's a potential for very direct activism. Within one of our groups, we were talking about, I mentioned an experience I'd had on a mountain in Puerto Rico of feeling like I was an acupuncture needle for the planet in a particular spot. And I think one way to imagine what our ancestors were doing when they gathered around locations that felt different is that they were engaged in a kind of activism. It was changing their mind, it was changing the community, and we don't know what effects it was having biospherically or not. But it seems in that moment very much like something is getting done. And then the other part to remember is that the world is, there's a background system in the world that keeps control of how things go, even when we do our activism, right? So one of the famous things is that most protests don't really accomplish anything because they occur within the background organizing frame of the system we have. And a number of philosophers have speculated that we might need to break out of that. You might need to do something that seems crazy. You might need to do something that seems magical or ritualistic or shamanic in order to do what Deleuze and Guattari called the appropriate deterritorialization that might have an effect on the system. Otherwise, it re-co-opts what you're trying to do too fast.
Well, I want to find out more about that deterritorialization. That sounds really interesting. Who was that again?
Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari were sort of leading edge French postmodern philosophers. They wrote a book called A Thousand Plateaus. They used, and shamanism deals with it a little bit, they used the model of the schizophrenic mind, or really the schizotypal mind, as a model for social activism, in the sense that it sort of is unpredictable to the lines of inquiry of the system outside itself. There's some very interesting things. The schizotypal designation is very interesting because one question that's come up a lot in like evolutionary psychology is why would evolution have preserved something like schizophrenia? But it's been speculated that it wasn't preserving schizophrenia, it was preserving schizotypal thinking, the ability to do something like schizophrenia, of which the schizophrenic is a minority example of a type of capacities to go into these strange modes that are being preserved through evolutionary history because they're hyper useful to the social enclaves that human beings have. I wanted to actually mention one thing about Marie's teddy bears, because my friend Alexander Bard is very interested in the role that the shamans played in intertribal communication and organization. And when you're going to move between tribes and between social contexts, various playful little magical things like having a teddy bear with you might make all the difference in the world between whether you're immediately killed by or welcomed into some foreign cultural context.
Okay, since we're in open conversation, it doesn't have to be a question for Layman. We can talk amongst ourselves as well. So whatever's coming to your attention, please bring it in to share with the rest of us.
I actually,
Layman,
go ahead. No, Suzanne, go ahead, please.
I always thought somebody
No,
else.
go. You please.
Well, Layman, you mentioned the trust, fundamental trust, or what did you call it? Primal trust. I'm also thinking of sacred laughter or cosmic laughter as one of the ways to eliminate or soften the boundaries between we as human beings and the rest of the world, the rest of being, sentience, just everything. That seems to help as well. Is that part of your perception?
I think comedy is one of the arts that descends from the primal archetype of what the shaman is, right? The shamanism, beautiful. I mean, we can think of artists, we think of comedians, we think of philosophers, we think of meditators as all sort of having a source in these fundamental Neolithic characters. And the comedy and the humor is a very important art in diffusing normal anxieties and overcoming simple social context rules. there's also something of the excessive element of it, which I really appreciate.
Yes.
Right? You could be in a very nice, positive, appreciative mentality toward all of the other beings, and that's good, that's appropriate, but it's also very tame, very kind of domesticated to have this nice feeling. When you erupt in laughter, when you're sharing the laughter of all the other beings, it's excessive, it's transformative, it's something that can't be contained by the form that you have. It spills out of your form, and it can in a way spill out of all the forms, and we can join together in some kind of cosmic laughter. And I think that's why we see it repeatedly showing up in the histories of certain kinds of saints.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, Phyllis, if you don't mind, I just wanted to hop onto that. I see Eloy put in the comments that we had a great session last summer with the comedian Alicia Dotner. I was remembering that while you were speaking, and the experience of laughter and my experience during that talk, which was, it was a wonderful session, is that real deep laughter, belly laughter, it kind of shakes us up. I mean, the diaphragm is involved. And for my purposes, I somatize my sense of the threshold between my conscious personality and my unconscious, my much larger unconscious. I imagine the boundary between the two, the semi-permeable memory as my diaphragm. And so I had the experience during that session with Alicia Dotner last summer, that when I was really deeply laughing, that my subconscious and conscious, they were communicating with each other across the boundary, that it was shaking things up and allowing a freer communication across. That was my experience. I just wanted to throw that in. Thanks, Phyllis, for letting me jump in.
Thank you. I feel like I'm going back to, I want to be silly, but I'm going back to a question about the shamanic stance. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the traditional shamanic stance is one not necessarily of healing, but one that orients towards healthy. And that there's a real big difference in that if the village was sick all the time, that's why you get the dead bodies of the shaman, because they're not the shaman, because they're not doing their job. Their job isn't to heal the village. Their job is to keep the village well. And from that point of view, if you're looking at like the meta crises, and then does the focus of that new shamanic stance become not necessarily healing the problems, but participating with the problems to move them towards health?
What I would say is that healing is a specialization of the shamanic. It's something that happens. Some of them might focus on that more. For everyone, it's going to be something that comes up periodically, is that something has to be rebalanced or redressed. But at a very basic level, one of the roles that shamans played anciently was to cultivate the rituals and the customs that the village participated in, and through that participation, it cultivated a life for that community that proceeded along healthy directions. So the shamanic ability to be the inventor and the custodian of the rituals that cultivate our life experience with each other, I think that's where we see that play out, right? Though the inventor of the customs has got to stand out for us, because we need to have customs that lead us to do things that solve our problems before they become problems for us, so to speak, right? What do we do with this and that circumstance in a way that creates more solutions than problems, so that we're not always in this reactive problem solving mode? And that's something that the kind of shaman experience that Karen was pointing at, where people have had these really transcendental or really fundamental experiences of a basic goodness and well-being in the universe that is experientially, phenomenologically prior to any problem. That kind of confidence in the shaman, I think, has traditionally oriented the healthy ones to creating a world in which intrinsic goodness shines forth rather than this constant makeup game of trying to solve the problems. So there's a good question. If we're going to create naturalness, I mean, that's one of those things. How do you create human social customs? How do you create ideas and experiences and ways of being together that just by doing them, the experience is one of more or less overflowing naturalness and steering in the right direction, regardless of the set of circumstances that we're facing? How do you take any set of circumstances and steer it in the right direction? I think that's fundamentally the thing they were very good at. And it's also something we see in the shamanic types of, say, tantric Buddhism and Hinduism. Really, how do you take over what the forces of the world are and steer them in the direction that we might want the Dharma to take us in?
Brings up a question for me, Layman, as the individual shaman versus a council, if you will, a shamanic council. And how would shamanic leadership work collectively?
Yeah, I would tend to think more in terms of shamanic networks now than councils. And they're absolutely necessary because not every shaman is going to be equally experienced, and they're all going to have different specializations, and they've got to be able to mutually mature and stabilize and support each other. How that looks like in terms of an actual social protocol for decision making between them, that's uncertain. One of the things we have to co-evolve together going forward are much smarter protocols for collective decision making. But whatever way ends up being useful within shamanic networks, it'll probably involve a great deal of individual liberty because you're expecting them each to be drawing on unseen and non-linear sources of information. So there's a great deal of trust in each one to be a distributed center of power. But they're the kind of things we need shamanic cultivators to do for the village of the world are so huge. Nobody can do it on their own. We need very large interactive networks of shamans at this point, and of all the different kind of flavors and styles of shamans, whether they think of themselves as that or not.
So Layman, I have a question. Do you have children? And what is the place of youth? And how do we call out the gifts and apprentice shamans?
Yeah, my house has 3 kids, and one of them has the temperaments that I associate with shamanism, but they all have little bits of it. But my focus is primarily on unforced developmental cultivation, right? And that the plant will show itself for what it's supposed to work on if you allow it to flourish as much as possible. So a lot of that is, first of all, just making sure they're all stable and intact. But beyond that, the proto skills is the term I use for like what turns regular experience and knowledge into something like wisdom. It's the use of something like proto skills. You're doing a lot more careful discerning. You're checking different systems within the self. You're trying to act on the basis of subtle prompts. You're trying to decode different regimes of your own experience. So these are areas in which any parental or pedagogical figure of any kind can try to elicit the subtler and more intentional dimensions of anybody's experience. And I think when you do that, the ones that are really interested in going further down those pathways start to show themselves.
You alluded earlier to a biosphere that was foundational to the noosphere, and you alluded to a different kind of biosphere. And I was wondering if you would mind speaking a little bit about that. I had the sense that it was sort of like a more metaphysical kind of second tier or third tier atmospheric something. I was wondering if you could just talk a little about that.
Yeah, in a way that was a reference to some of Ken Wilber's thinking on this subject. He takes up this idea from Teilhard de Chardin and some of the other thinkers around how the noosphere enfolds the biosphere, right? And so he's very explicit in his work that the fact that nature is bigger than us doesn't mean that the biosphere is a more advanced level than the noosphere. So that's an interesting critique. We can take that or leave that, but we can also imagine a different kind of biosphere that enfolds and embraces the noosphere. And when people have profound experiences of the need to repattern human civilization in ways that are more richly ecological, I don't think they're having primitive experiences in that developmental sense, right? That's not regressive. And if you were to encounter the spirit of a tree, let's say, right, you're encountering something that has noospheric significance, human significance. You're encountering it in the form of something that's ecological, but you're not encountering the ecological as if it was superior. It might feel like that in that moment because of the overwhelming significance, but you're encountering the ecological as the container and the structuring principle for the noospheric depths of wisdom. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a very useful way to think about it. If the ecosystem's basic patterns are used as a constraint on the noosphere and provide the container in which the noosphere allows itself to navigate towards some of its options and away from some of its other options, then you get something that's more like a hybridization of the two. And that can look very biological. A lot of people mean that when they say Gaia, but then a lot of other people, when they say Gaia, just mean the networks of cells on the planet interacting with each other. So we want to be careful to tease that apart a little bit and to leave open a lot of space for there to really be something transformational and post-human and sacred, but post-human in the way that it still includes the human and the cultural.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Do you think that that it's a question of nomenclature, that there's another word that needs to be that we don't have for that concept, or that they are that intrinsically close?
I think the ability to make the distinction is essential, right? And if a word helps you make that distinction, fantastic. But we don't want to get caught in any of the phraseology. And it might be that the next person in line makes the same distinction using a different kind of terminology. So the most important thing is to be able to make some kind of distinction, whatever we call that.
Thank you.
I guess we're at the end.
I was just waving goodbye to Suzanne, but yeah, we can. Any last questions or comments before we? I would, bye Suzanne. I would love to invite you back at another time, Layman. We can talk about that for a future meeting, but it seems like you've got more than enough to offer, and you certainly engaged us all at a lot of levels.
It's been fantastic. This is a really good crowd. I'd be happy to come back, not in a month or two, but
right. No, it'll be a bit. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Sounds be good. Well, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, look for our stuff. We'll be putting up our info as soon as we get it for next month.
Thank you.
And we'll have the recording up in the next couple of days, and post that in the chat. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
For further information, including upcoming events, resources, links to our Facebook and Meetup pages, and our fabulous donate button, please visit our website at sandiegointegral.org. Donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue to provide information and connection within the Integral community.